So John McKinnon is going to speak to us first.
But I think the thing that I have to start with was the thing which made itself very much felt to me in the 1970s was that, and it may seem glaringly obvious, but that China and New Zealand are very, very different places. And how on earth does a country like New Zealand relate to a country like China? How does a country like China relate to a country like New Zealand? This is a perennial issue, and in the time that I've been working on China matters from the mid-1970s, we've had many different ways of thinking about it and talking about it. But in some ways, the calculus that was made in 1972, when we established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic, still holds today. And that is that we did that because at the end of the day, we recognised that to be in this part of the world, in the Asia-Pacific region, and not to have relations with the government of Beijing was actually just injuring ourselves and damaging ourselves. We were not being able to have the lines of communication and the lines of influence with the people who were controlling a very large population in a very large part of the world. And that political imperative that it was important for us to have a relationship with the people in China and the government in China, regardless of what we thought about it, was, I think, still something which was valid then and which I think is still valid now. We may not always like things that are going on in China, and China may not always like things that it sees here. But regardless of that, we have to find ways of connecting with one another. And so that calculus, which I think was largely political, some people say it was to do with trade. Actually, the trade between China and New Zealand in 1972 was insignificant, and in fact it was only about a decade or so later that it really began to grow. I think that was part of it, but I don't think it was the major part of it. I think the major part of it was this recognition that we had to be connected in some way with the government in Beijing. And we did that because China was an important country then, which was hugely to New Zealand's benefit. China became a wealthy country, and now China is quite a powerful country, influential in the region and influential in the world. And in a sense, we're all coming to terms and trying to think about what that actually means for us. But I think this is a challenging period for China-New Zealand relations. I don't think that's a particularly startling statement to make. You only have to read the newspaper every day to discover that there seems to be a new China story. In fact, one of my colleagues in one of my erstwhile places of employment said he didn't realise China was so dominant in the New Zealand discourse until he took over a particular section of this ministry which dealt with that. So China looms large, and I want to just unpack for you a little bit what I regard as three reasons why the New Zealand-China relationship is more challenging and more sort of involved now than it used to be. And those three changes, some have taken place in New Zealand, some have taken place in China, and some have taken place in the world. Now, in New Zealand, one of those big changes, certainly if I compare New Zealand of 1975, when I first went to Hong Kong, with the New Zealand now, is there's a huge increase in the numbers of Chinese people and Asians in New Zealand. So that has altered the dynamic of our society. It's altered the way, particularly in this city, that people think and operate. I think it's been immensely enriching, but it's no doubt that it's altered certain ways in which people think about China and think about New Zealand's relations with China. Chinese are very prominent in terms of investors, in terms of migrants, and were, until very recently, of course, because of the pandemic and extraneous elements such as that, as students and as tourists. So there's been a huge alteration in the domestic profile, you might say, of China in New Zealand. And while that is, I think, largely, it's a very positive experience which has occurred, it's also something which policy people and political leaders have to sort of process and think about. So there have been changes in New Zealand. We've seen some of that in some of the controversies which have surrounded some of the political parties. Secondly, of course, there have been changes in China. There is a new, well, not newish leader now. Xi Jinping first came to office in 2012, so that's about 8 years ago. But there's no doubt there is now a greater confidence, a greater commitment on the part of China to being in the world and part of the world. And like every country. It wants to shape the world in its own, to seek its own benefit and to serve its own objectives. There's nothing particularly startling or unusual about that, but for the China that people were used to in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, when basically Chinese did not go out into the world, this is a very different sort of world, and it's certainly one which has aroused quite a lot of attention. And there are some things about that outreach, both within China and outside, that certainly arouse a lot of contention and arouse a lot of attention in the world beyond China. And then thirdly, I said there were changes in the world, and to some extent, this is perhaps a function of the second thing. China has changed, and the world is still figuring out what that means in terms of its reaction to it. So you have differing views coming out of Washington, you have different views coming out of Canberra and Tokyo, you have different views coming out of Europe now about what China means for the world. And this is something which, again, is in a sense part of the natural warp and woof of international relations, but it's also quite challenging. If you're sitting, as a political leader in New Zealand, you've got to be very mindful of these diversity of views about what is happening with China and how it's undertaking and so on and so forth. So that I think there is an environment now in which discussions about China and discussions about New Zealand's relations with China are edgier and, in a sense, more difficult to conduct than they would have been, say, 5 or 10 years ago, let alone earlier ago. To some extent, it's a bit of a hark back to an earlier period. But what does that mean for us? Because it's all very well to talk about, what's going on in Beijing or what's going on in Washington or Tokyo, but what does it mean for here in New Zealand? And I think there are a couple of things to be said here, which are quite important in terms of the framing and the context for how we connect with China. Firstly, as has already been mentioned, China is a very significant trade and economic partner for New Zealand, and it will likely continue to be so for quite some time. In fact, when I went to China in 2001 to 2004, China was about our 4th or 5th largest export market. When I went there in 2015, China was sort of neck and neck with Australia. By the time I left, China was definitely in the lead. Now, there's a lot of talk now about diversification and reducing dependence and exposure to one particular market or one particular supplier. This is partly embedded in the New Zealand psyche because of what we went through in the 1950s and 60s. But I think the point I would make is that it's hard to see any one single country replacing China as a source of demand for what New Zealand produces. And what people in China like about New Zealand is food. And secondly and thirdly, although again this is slightly constrained at the moment, scenery and schooling. So these are things which to a large extent are characteristic at the moment of the New Zealand-China relationship. They're not quite the same as the relationships which other Western countries have with China, whether that's Australia or America or Europe or whoever. There's very little manufacturing involved in that sense. But there are a lot of service industries. There's a lot of interest in high-quality, clean food coming from New Zealand into China. So that in that sense, as well as the sheer size of the Chinese economy, the sheer size of its middle class, however you define that, I think that New Zealand's economic future with China is reasonably well assured. But beyond that, there's also a second element, which is, as I said earlier, back in the calculus of 1972, China as a regional power and as a global power. It's hard to see how we can conduct our policy, whether that's in the we being, in this case, New Zealand, using a sort of a royal we, how we can conduct our policy, whether in areas like the South Pacific and Antarctica, where China is much more prominent now than it used to be, or whether it's in the APEC/EAS type area, or globally on issues such as climate change and the integrity of multilateral institutions without engaging with China. We can't always agree on where we want to go in those issues, but what we do know is that if we don't communicate with China, we won't understand where China's coming from, and also, importantly, China won't understand where we're coming from. There are going to be areas which the Chinese government feels very anxious and concerned about, and it will also want to express that concern. That is why I said earlier that this society and its particular commitment to that relationship is very important, and the role you play is very important, but it's also, I think, quite a difficult one at the moment, because there is a little bit of a tendency to go black and white, to go very binary. Either you're sort of absolutely, somebody who's over on that side, or you're somebody who's over on this side. And, I think we haven't really got to that point here in New Zealand, but I've certainly seen signs of it in some other parts of the world. And in a sense, it's a testimony to the success that China has been in growing and becoming such an important country in the world that now people are getting quite anxious and quite worried about it. We need to keep communicating. We need to keep talking, even if we have disagreements. And especially if we have disagreements, it's important to keep those lines of communication open, because otherwise we're never going to know what is really animating people in China, and equally they will not know why it is that our governments say and do certain things, whether that's in relation to extradition agreements or whatever it is. It will be evident to you that I've got two fundamental propositions. One is that China is a country we have to connect with and we have to find ways of connecting with. But secondly, there are always going to be issues which we have different views on and different perspectives on. And the professional challenge or the political challenge or the actual challenge is, how do you manage a relationship while respecting those differences at the same time as you continue to place value in the things which both bind you together and create common interests. People often talk about this as a contrast between interests and values, or as between economic prosperity on the one hand and political security on the other. I don't quite see it like that, because it seems to me that our relationship with China has to be multifaceted. It has to encompass both political and economic and social and cultural means, just as our relations do with the United States or with Australia or with countries with which we are much more similar. In fact, in some ways, we have to work harder precisely because China is more different than some of those other places. The New Zealand connection with China is a little bit different even from the Australian, let alone the American or the British or the European or whatever. There is both an economic and trade sense, but also in terms of our population, in terms of some other elements. And that may mean that we can be a little bit different. It may mean that China looks upon us differently. That's something I'd have to get Chinese people to tell me rather than me speculating myself. So I think there is the bones of a dilemma, George, but I'm not sure I would quite call it a dilemma. I'd say it's a challenge. And I think that challenge is significant, and I think for the future of our country, it's important that we face up to it, and it's important that we actually somehow or other get it right.
I agree with all that you say. Although I would say that there is a dilemma, and the dilemma is that we think we have a dilemma. We think we have to choose. And the trouble for New Zealand is that we're challenged by the thing that the whole of the Western world is currently facing. And it's a trauma that the country that we watched come from poverty to multiply its economy to become, and if you look at purchasing power parity, China now is the largest economy in the world. Not the most powerful, not the most influential. America is still that, but it's the largest. So the country that people came to know in the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s was a country that was coming out of poverty. It was a country that wasn't very confident. China struggled in its position globally and dealing with international institutions. And the perspective I found living in China as a Westerner was that China was easy to deal with because it could be condescended to. We were the white Anglo-Saxon world that had ruled everything for the last 300 or so years. So dealing with China was a process of dealing with an inferior. America certainly felt that. I think to some extent, New Zealand had a little more of a perspective, not out of virtue, but just because of our own political insignificance. And that's a gift if you're a New Zealander travelling the globe, and certainly if you're living in a country like China. And the problem that's occurred isn't that China's changed profoundly, but China has become confident and China's become strong. And particularly America fears that China's going to take away something that we once had. And we are in the process in the Western world of facing decline. I don't mean ruin or destruction, but Western influence, Western models are in steep decline. Two examples. One is the global financial crisis. If you think back to probably the greatest act of corruption in the world since the Second World War was the global financial crisis. A total destruction of value in hundreds of millions of people's lives across the globe that had no fault at all, but were victims of investment bankers, finance firms trying to extract as much as they possibly could out of an area of the economy that had little value. These rubbish mortgages packaged up and securitized. And what happened during the first 6 months that the global financial crisis hit? The rest of the world was afraid. They didn't know how to actually deal with the financial institutions that had caused the problem. Obama had become president, but instead of replacing and restructuring the American financial system, he put the same people back in charge. We stumbled on. The same pools of capital remained where they were, and many, many countries went into very difficult times. So as we stumbled along, but getting poorer and poorer, losing our confidence, and in some ways, losing value that we have still not regained, China did something else. China looked at the crisis. It misread the crisis because it thought it was going to be hit like Western countries. But it wasn't, because China doesn't have a convertible currency. China didn't have a very open stock exchange. And its financial system was essentially closed and very conservative. But China invested. It invested in companies that it feared might go out of business. It increased social investment in cities and counties. It invested in industries that knew would employ more people and stabilize the economy. It took a very socialist approach to what was essentially a very strong, very powerful, and very ruthless market forces economy. And as it came out of the global financial crisis, because it spent on its people, because it invested in its society and its stability, and wasn't worried about the fact that it had to hold on to something in terms of the wealth in the banks or the value in the companies, it retained its commercial value in all quarters of its economy. So as it came out of the global financial crisis, China was stronger than before, and a bit baffled and dazed. It didn't know what it was going to do, because it suddenly found itself as this much stronger economy, and this wonderful Western capitalist model that it had so much respect for, that it had been trying to model itself on, had failed and failed in every way. So China looked at the world and it thought, wait a minute, do we want to really become what the Western global financial system is? And the decision makers in China, the bankers particularly, but those advising the Chinese government, worked out that they didn't want to become that because it was inherently unstable. So they took a different tack. And China is a marvelous contradiction of free market forces, strong capitalist instincts, but it is also a socialist economy. And the thing that people miss about Xi Jinping is that he embodies both those instincts and both those things in the way that he plans. Then the next challenge comes across, which is the big challenge, which is COVID-19. And the myth is that it was from some chemical lab in Wuhan that a bug got loose and we've all suffered from it. The other was that they hid the numbers, and so China was lying, and therefore the rest of the world got sick. They did hide the numbers for 6 whole days. That's the actual time before the central government stepped in and took over in Wuhan from what the municipality was trying to disguise. And it's a problem of the model in terms of governance in China, that you get punished for bringing bad news. So sometimes exposing a problem that needs to be exposed can really be expensive for you if you're an official. Nonetheless, it was only 6 days. Generously, maybe 12. But America was informed through the WHO, and then China basically cracked down on COVID socially. It sent out the instructions that it was going to be tracing the disease wherever it could, but it wanted everyone to go home. And just like New Zealand, because I was leaving China at that time, people went home because it was the fair thing to do. They didn't understand. They knew that their own leadership didn't understand. And I lived through SARS in Beijing, which was a similar, although a much more contained equivalent to COVID-19 in some ways. And they did the thing that we did, which was a sense of community. I won't get sick, but someone really old like John McKinnon might get sick, so we have to protect him. And I think those are instincts of community, of collectivity, that actually, because of the smallness and isolation of New Zealand, because of the youth of New Zealand, these instincts are very similar here. We're asked to look at the fact that As a country, our association was with our parliamentary system from Britain, and all of us are children of the American Revolution. No country that became a nation after that event can't owe something to those founding fathers and those very modern concepts of society. And where do we stand? And I think the trouble is that New Zealand believes it has to make a choice. New Zealand makes decisions according to its own principles. It's not bullied by those other 4 Five Eyes partners, and that we have our independent relationship with China based on our principles, our interests, and international law. And that announced this week, or her foreign minister did, that we're going to suspend our extradition treaty with Hong Kong. And it's been much applauded. And everyone's saying that's right, because look what the Chinese government's doing in poor old Hong Kong. And it's a terrible rort that they're going to change the security law there. Well, we didn't need to suspend our extradition treaty. We just needed to say, as she said the week before, let's watch this. We're worried about the ramifications of a change of law in Hong Kong. Because under that law, Beijing can do some things that are pretty bad. You know, big countries do crappy things. And sometimes China does really bad things. And they may decide to try people in courts in mainland China that would otherwise have been tried within the common law system that still exists in Hong Kong. They may interfere with the media. Certainly some journalists have begun to leave. But they haven't really done that yet. So the right thing to do would have been to wait and say, we are not going to act now. We're not going to be drawn in to the other countries around the world that actually are not acting on principle. They don't care about the people of Hong Kong. What they care about is that they want to join in the survival of a Western bloc, very much led by America. So my problem with New Zealand's choice this week is that this was a foolish act. When you don't have to do something, don't do it. If I asked you how many extraditions under the current extradition treaty that's just been suspended had taken place between Hong Kong and New Zealand, you'd come up with all sorts of numbers. The number is 4. And those are New Zealand requesting people to be extradited back to New Zealand from Hong Kong. So where's the issue here? We have a legal system, we have a judicial process that we're not going to be drawn into something we can't control because there's a new security law in Hong Kong. And why is there a new security law in Hong Kong? The reason it's there is because Hong Kong has been suffering from a streak of terrorism through what was otherwise a well-principled, a well-disciplined and very peaceful protest movement. And I have a deep interest in protest and protest movements and how they come about, because by coincidence and somewhat by folly, in 1989 I was in Beijing and I witnessed Tiananmen Square. I was at the edge of the square. I was on the area of the square for about 12 hours through the pitch of the troops coming in and the carnage that took place. I was in Beijing in the months leading up to Tiananmen Square and walked alongside the demonstrations and asked people why they were demonstrating. I listened to the speeches in the square, and I saw the aftermath once the troops had come in. And not to focus on Tiananmen Square and judge it one way or the other, although I'm prepared to do that on a different occasion, what I saw was peaceful people trying to express something very simple to a government that couldn't listen. As a result, it built and it built. And many, many more themes came into these people's minds, and the complexity then of the protests was a real threat to the Chinese government. But because they couldn't listen, it got out of hand. But that happened in 1989. There has not been another Tiananmen Square since 1989. And what was happening in Hong Kong was peaceful protests. I thought, well, to understand this better, I want to go to Hong Kong and try and compare the experience. And I walked in the demonstrations. I talked to the people who were involved in apparently organising them, although they disguised the leadership very carefully, because in previous years, leaders have been arrested by the Hong Kong police and there'd been issues, so they were very good at disguising who was leading the protests. And it was fine. I saw people pick up empty plastic drink bottles and put them in bins. I saw them gesture to other protesters to move away from climbing on a barrier. It was a very disciplined. Gandhi could not have had better raw material. Then they gathered and came to about 10,000 people in the area of Causeway Bay. And I went onto an overbridge. Naively, I looked around and all these press people with goggles on, and they had helmets on their heads and they had respiratory equipment. And I was thinking, no, this is bit of smoke, it'll be fine. The protest built and it built. And then I saw the police move back in their lines with their strange pale green uniforms. They looked very unmilitant, backing away from the demonstration. And I could see what they were doing. They were going to let this thing spend itself out because it goes later and later and people go home. But it didn't happen. They started to set fire to barricades that they'd built out of bits and pieces, plastic bolsters and stuff around. And then the fire really began to burn, and the fire engines tried to come through the crowd and they were stopped. And the police moved towards the crowd to help the fire engines get to the burning barricades. And out of the crowd came people with black masks, all in black, hurling Molotov cocktails. When they landed where you were sitting, the police didn't move. When it landed in front of the stage, they didn't move. When the flames began to touch their boots, they moved in and they tackled the protesters. And I saw guys with ball bearings in what looked like stockings, but they were slingshots firing them at the police. Then there was tear gas fired and the police moved in further and the protesters became mixed and began to run in different directions. I left because the tear gas was stinging my eyes, but I'd seen enough. I thought, that's fine, I'll go back to Kowloon. I'm staying in the YMCA, where I stayed in the 80s on my way to China, and I always stay there. It's quite a nice hotel. And Nathan Road was in flames. There was hundreds and hundreds of meters of burning shop fronts, and the whole of the subway station on one side was in fire. That was 6 months before the end of last year, because Hong Kong didn't have a security law. There was supposed to be one. As Chris reminded me, Section 23 of the Handover Accord was that they will enact a security law, because we have one. If we've got a problem, we can move in with police, we can even put the army in place if we need to. They didn't have a security law. So in the ineffectualness of the Hong Kong government, this wasn't done. China has said you need to put in a security law. They didn't go in with their troops. They could have under the Handover Accord. I'm not apologising for China. I'm not apologising for the kind of rhetoric that sometimes China uses, but that's the sequence of events. So now there is a security law in place. There aren't demonstrations now because they know that they will be arrested promptly, and that the new regulations mean they can be incarcerated for longer and charged under different treason, sedition type rules. That's what they did. No country I know, and my own country, which I love, and I understand how stable and how decent New Zealand is. But when things go wrong, we don't want to have burning barricades. We don't want to have destruction and violence where they would go online, find the names of cops in an area, and then they'd talk to their kids going to school, saying the things they would do to their families. Not good. So that's what triggered this change in the law in Hong Kong. Do we hear that in the press? No. Now, bad things will happen because of the law, and there's been some kidnappings of booksellers and stuff that shouldn't have happened. China does bad stuff. But we don't get that information here because we're being asked to join this containment of China led by Washington. Since 1972, when Kissinger went, that was to base a whole lot of reasons why Nixon and Kissinger went. But essentially, they went to open diplomatic relations and open trade with China, but they always wanted to contain China. And every year since then until now, the aim of the US is to prevent China from rising, because America thinks its own ills are a product of China's rise, that somehow China's taken from them to become powerful, and America's internally falling apart in places because of China. I don't see that as true. Most great empires and civilizations fall from within. They don't get taken from without. They appear to, because once they've fallen from within and are weaker, they get taken from without. America has no need to look at China as the architect of its current demise. It's not. But that's what we're being asked to do. So on Monday last week, the Prime Minister was spot on with her language. New Zealand is a non-allied country. We make our own decisions. We went nuclear free. We had a free trade agreement with China and were derided when we said that China was a free market economy, because the other Western economies didn't like that. I hope we can follow the same thing, because if we can't, we will end up trying to choose, who are we with today? Where's our interest? We make more money out of China. We're afraid of being rejected by Washington. These are very foolish motives to end up in a dilemma. But our politicians are in a position where, if they're not careful, they may do. I also have confidence, which I think John does, that the Helen Clark, John Key, and now Jacinda Ardern line of consistency is people trying their very best for New Zealand and not really looking to bring us into some camp and some point of Western power to make New Zealand stronger. I think it's understood that our strength is being ourselves and acting from ourselves as a country. China's watching closely because we are unique. There are no other Western countries that have the same track record of initiating things for China, of standing up on principle for things that others were not prepared to stand on. So the dilemma is, increasingly, we're going to be asked to be drawn into this very dangerous, this pointless attempt to contain China, reduce China, because we're afraid we're losing our mojo as the West. And who are we allying ourselves? Who's our leader in this? Donald Trump, who's conducted a trade war with China, which is one of the greatest acts of economic self-harm since the Trojans thought that was a nice horse standing outside the gates. And he's using Cold War tactics in his trade war. And it's a very dangerous situation. So we have to be careful, not just because China might not buy our stuff. That's another thing. It's 30% of our trade. Then takes the next 4 or 5 countries. And they're also another 30%. And that's a big block too. They're made up of people like Japan, the European Union, the US, Australia, of course. So it's not just about China. But for our own national integrity, for our own evolution as a country, we need to get this, watch this battle, and take a Tai Chi approach. When people are swinging around, make a space. Only act if we have to. And then not act out of strength, out of restraint. It's okay to piss off Canberra. It's quite a good thing, actually. It's quite good right now to upset Donald Trump. And I'm sure Boris Johnson is not someone from whom New Zealand will gain anything in particular, economically or politically. But we've got to be careful because the rest of the world and the Western media is trying to make us believe that we have to choose between the West and China. We don't. We choose ourselves. And by choosing ourselves and choosing to be true to ourselves, we'll deal with both the West and China. And just to finish, I think the interesting fact that has also surprised me is the economic recovery and recovery of social confidence in China. I hate to say post-COVID because there is no post-COVID, but most of the industries are back. Most of New Zealand's exports are now being consumed there. There is relative mobility around China of people travelling for business. Tourism is not so great. The catering sector's still very badly hurt because of restaurants closing and even the companies that used to put restaurants, catering systems into factories aren't functioning for a whole lot of perceived health-related reasons. But by and large, China's back. And that is the engine, like after the global financial crisis, that will gradually lift the world out of the recession we're now entering. So it's important globally that China continues on the path it continues economically. It's important socially that China remains a stable and integrated country. And it's important that we understand it, as John said, for what it is, but we relate to it from ourselves and we are not bullied by our Five Eyes partners in some strange attempt to try and lock it down and prevent it from evolving. So trying to address a subject I wish I hadn't broached in the first place, that's the dilemma, I think, that there isn't a dilemma, but we imagine there is.
What worries you most, John? What do you worry most about in the relationship with New Zealand and China? And then your turn.
What do I worry most about? What an excellent question. I worry that we will get it wrong. I think that would be my simplest worry, that in other words, New Zealand's management of the China relationship somehow or other will take us into a place we shouldn't probably be. And that's in a sense why I was saying that this is high-stakes stuff. Getting it right is more than just important. I think it's crucial for our national future. So that would be my worry. It's not a worry particularly about China or particularly about New Zealand. It's just that we manage a relationship in a way which is going to be productive for both parties.
We're an unusual nation in that we are colonised and for a long time dominated largely by white Anglo-Saxon people. Now we're not so much that. We're a much more mixed society. And that mixed nature of our society is our destiny. And we can embrace who we are now, and increasingly with our Chinese population, the Indian population, Koreans, so many countries of people have come, and they now have considerable cohorts here. We can become more universal ourselves and more understanding of other countries we interact with, rather than hope that everyone turns out to be like the sort of standard New Zealander, the sort of white middle class person, or a person that has a kind of same attachment as I have to our history and heritage. So it's embracing the way we're changing and how China contributes to that, and is already in terms of those that have come to live here.
Thank you both very much for that session, and can we thank both John and everything else now.